Good evening. I'm Karen Taylor, Program Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to tonight's lecture, which is part of our Artisan Lecture series, and a very special lecture, and it marks the end of our fall lecture series. The Artisan Lectures are supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. I also want to give thanks to our window curator, Thomas Donahue, who created a special window for this evening. For those of you who may be less familiar with the General Society, a brief introduction. And for those of you who've heard this many times before, I hope you'll bear with me. The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York is a non-profit organization that was founded in 1785 by 22 artisans. Today, our 234-year-old organization continues to serve and improve the quality of life of the people of the City of New York through our educational and cultural programs, including our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, the General Society Library, which is going to celebrate 200 years next year, our lecture series, which began in 1837, and the John M. Mossman Lock Museum. You'll find additional information on your seat. Our Lock Museum has a particular significance this evening. As it is there, I met our speaker for tonight, Anne-Marie Richards, who is exploring the museum. We fell into conversation, and I found out about the fascinating program that Sotheby offers, and Anne-Marie's own role in it. I asked if she would consider speaking here, and as they say, the rest is history. Anne-Marie Richard is the director of the MA Fine and Decorative Art and Design program of Sotheby's Institute of Art. Ms. Richard is a fine art asset and design specialist, art historian, curator, author, and advisor. Prior to her appointment as program director at Sotheby's, she was executive vice president at the art advisory firm Gurr-Johns. She has lectured extensively on the topics of retrospective and emerging art markets, connoisseurship, collecting, conservation, provenance, and the related subtleties of appraising fine and decorative art and design. She will also is the upcoming author, indeed is a current author, of a book that will be published in 2020, The Valuation of Fine Art and Design, a Handbook for Professionals. It is my huge pleasure to introduce to you Anne-Marie Richard.
Thank you very much. It is a great honor to be here this evening. Thank you very much for braving the cold. And as Ms. Taylor introduced me, I am the MA Director at the Sotheby's Institute for a very large category, which includes fine art, decorative arts, and design, and more on that later. So the title of my lecture this evening is Hammer in Homework. As you know, in auction, we have a different type of hammer. We have gavel and homework, which I consider probably the most important tool in valuation and appraising of works of art, as you have to study, and it really is an education to look at works of art on a daily basis. On that note, I thought I would just show you what Sotheby's looked like in 1744. This was in London and the Strand, the Exeter Exchange, and you see Royal Menagerie with all the animals. It was actually a zoo at some point. And I like this print very much because it kind of illustrates that the trading of works of art is just the same as the trading of cattle and animals. If you've ever been at a farm auction, there's really not that much difference between what's going on there and what's going on in the posh sales room, Rockefeller Center or York Avenue. So what fuels auctions, really? Well, when I started my career, everybody talked about the 3Ds. Death, as exemplified by this Baroque bust, personification of Memento Mori. Debt, divorce, girl with red balloon, the Bansky. And the fourth D, which suddenly appeared in the trade language in the last decade, disaster. And I chose to illustrate disaster with this Japanese woodblock print that illustrates James John Audubon discovering that all his watercolors had been chewed by rats for feathering their nest. So the auction trade is really fueled by all this devastation, poverty. Here we have a painting in the collection of the General Society entitled From Riches to Poverty, and an Emily Osborne painting called Nameless and Friendless, which is in the Tate Britain, illustrating a lady bringing a picture to be appraised with the intent of getting some sort of interesting monies in exchange. So let's get back to Sotheby's and why the Institute actually exists. About 50 years ago in London, the auction house realized that there was not that much of a succession plan in terms of educational knowledge of objects in different categories of objects. So they founded the Institute to encourage the younger generation to be interested in ceramics, silver, furniture, watercolors, prints, and paintings, and have them work hand in hand with the auction experts so this knowledge would not be lost and the trade could continue. And in 1984, the program moved to the United States, where in New York they founded the American Works of Art course, which has now been split into 3 different programs: the Masters in Art Business, the Masters in Contemporary Art, and my program, which is the Foundation program of Works of Art, where we learn all kinds of different categories of works of art and the related markets. This is just a photograph of some of my students looking at a 19th century French gilt wood frame that has been resized. So what we do, the pedagogy of learning is really about hands-on, because if you don't hold the objects, you really don't know what you're looking at. You can't do that through the internet. There's a lot of information on the internet, but you can't smell, you can't taste, you can't feel the weight, you can't look very carefully at the details, you can't see how the object has been put together, and that is imperative in order to be able to appraise it. This is an auction catalog dated to 1753. As you see, it's a tiny little book, and that's how auction catalogs used to be produced. We teach cataloging and how to put together a sale. It really hasn't changed since the 18th century. It's still the same process of describing the object, giving the factual information. What object is it? Is it a painting? What's the iconography? What are the dimensions? Dimensions being very imperative if you're going to be wanting to correspond it with a catalogue raisonné or a specific estate. And I brought here a 1960s catalogue of Sotheby's from Newport, when all the mansions in Newport, a lot of them anyway, were deaccessioning in order to maintain their houses. And you'll see that the only difference between the 18th century and the 19th and 20th century is the inclusion of photographs. Now, the scholarship has changed a lot. There's a lot of objects in these old catalogs that have been reassessed. So, for example, if you bought something in the 1960s in one of these sales and you brought it today to be reappraised, you might have a shock. The scholarship constantly develops, and it's very important to know how they described objects and what happened between then and now. And that's just one aspect that we discuss in class. So the whole process of the auctioneering really hasn't changed. There's paddles being distributed, you register, and here you have a Rowlandson 18th century print illustrating an auction, which, if you look at a work of art and think of it in terms of sound, it's a very loud type of illustration. It's not like that anymore. They're much more controlled environments. Unless you go to the continent. I was just in Paris where I attended a couple of auctions, and it was completely chaotic and very theatrical, which lots of things happen. It was really like attending a show. Elements of surprise, suddenly the auction stopped, there was a melee in the back of the room, then somebody kind of showed up and had this grand gesture towards this mirror that had been broken by accident by somebody else. So it's actually very entertaining. In New York, it's not so much like that anymore, but it's interesting to see how it's done in other countries. So value, people always come up and say, well, what do you think of this? You know, do you think I can buy an apartment in New York with this table or with this chair? Well, unfortunately, the market ebbs and flows with trends and fashions, narratives, questions of connoisseurship. Connoisseurship changes all the time. Disputes arise as to attribution, and narratives. You know, there's nothing better than a good story in order to sell a work of art. So what are we looking at here? This is a Andy Warhol painting that fetched in the vicinity of 100 million. And the interior of this fantastic mansion up in the Bronx, the Bartopel. And if you took everything in the Bartopel mansion, you would not arrive to such a number. And yet, this is culturally very important for the history of New York, whereas the Andy Warhol is a completely different conceptual kind of idea. So the value is really relative. What do we value might not necessarily translate into a financial asset. So here we have the cataloging for the Andy Warhol, and we have, which describes a very, very disturbing car accident, and fetches, you know, in excess of 100 million, and the Bartopel mansion, which is a very tranquil, beautiful, bucolic mansion, which is really worth a fraction of what the painting would be. As I mentioned earlier, value changes with times. We don't really value so much stained glass anymore. It's kind of disappeared a little bit in terms of financial asset. But in the 16th century, 15th century, the Renaissance value for something like this, which is not a very large work of art, would be 12 cows. A painting would only be worth 5 cows. So you see how there's been a reversed in perception of value. Associative value. So Andy Warhol dies in 1987, and Sotheby's ended up with the dispersion of his personal property, the Andy Warhol collection in 1988, and it turns out he was a voracious collector of cookie jars. Now the cookie jars individually or in groups don't really have that much of an intrinsic value. This is the cataloging for one lots. The lots in the Andy Warhol sales were comprised of several cookie jars. So this is lot 838, 4 American pottery cookie jars, comprising a McCoy, a National Silver, a Shawnee Puss in Boots, and an elephant. Pre-sale estimate 100 to 150, which would be completely reasonable considering the market for cookie jars then. Realize $11,000. Now, if we owned these cookie jars, we would never attain this kind of value. These are called aberrational sales. It's because they have this association with the artist, which is one of the most important artists of the 20th century. Just to give you an idea of what they're actually worth. Okay, $26.99. Just in case you go home and try to bank on your cookie jars. And this one, $34.99. And they really haven't changed in value that much since he died. I mean, you would think that if somebody had analyzed everything in the Andy Warhol lots, they might think, oh, well, you know, maybe I can get a couple of hundred for this. But no, they're always between $25 and $49.99. So, no luck. This is a rather, I would say, ordinary-looking rocking chair. It's got a condition issue, fabric ripped on the arm. It was made in Asheboro, North Carolina, which is the center of mass-manufactured furniture in the United States. And you could probably get that at auction for $10, $20, maybe at the most $50. That is, unless it belonged to JFK. And it fetched in 1996 close to $500,000 against a pre-sale estimate to $3,000 to $5,000, which was extremely generous prior to the sale. So here you have the photography documentation. You have the president sitting on his favorite rocking chair. Now, if you take the provenance out, this is an example where there's no provenance. Estimated price 80 to 150, realized 0. Because it's just, even with the documentation, if it doesn't have the context of the Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis sale, it's really not that interesting anymore. You really need that veneer of a direct line to the associative person of interest, in this case, JFK, but not just JFK within the estate of Jacqueline Onassis. This is a very quite well-known photograph of Jacqueline Kennedy and John F. Kennedy Jr., where the little boy is playing with his mother's pearl necklace, and it's well documented. She wore fake pearls. This is Kenneth J. Lane, or one of costume designer, costume jewelry. This, in 1996, fetched $200,000 against a $500 to $700 estimate. And again, without, you know, the association of Jacqueline Kennedy, you have a $12 necklace. So some of my students ask me, well, what happens if I buy this necklace and I sit on it for 20 years? If I resell it, do I get this magic again? And unfortunately, you don't. There were 2 necklaces sold within that sale, and the other one came up for auction last year, and it came, you know, somebody had bought it at the Kennedy estate in '96, and it only fetched $30,000. Okay, so you're never gonna, you can only monetize it once. Closer in time, Christie's sold a David Rockefeller collection in estate. The online sale was interesting. everybody was talking about the money clip that had the Rockefeller Center stamped on the brass clip. And that also fetched some extraordinary amount. I think it was $75,000 against a pre-sale estimate of a couple of thousand. But I can almost understand why somebody would want something from Rockefeller that actually illustrates something that Rockefeller had built. These cufflinks, for the purpose of this lecture, are more interesting because they're completely anonymous. They're just, they're very lovely martini glass cufflinks, and the pre-sale was 400 to 600, and they fetched 13,000. So there's no Cartier, there's no Van Cleef, there's no Paul Flato, or any kind of jeweler associated with this. They're completely anonymous, and yet, because of the associative value, they shot up. If any of you really follow the market for New York-centric objects, when the Four Seasons closed down, there was a big sale. And the little porcelain ashtrays at very, very low estimates, something like $40 to $60 or $100 to $200, and they went for $1,600. So everybody was trying to get, at that minute, a little piece of New York history. Now, will these little coasters, porcelain coasters, ever achieve these kinds of prices? Probably not. One aspect we talk about in my classes and generally is the importance of knowing who are the players, who are the important collectors. This morning I was talking to my students. I said, who are the rubber barons of New York City? And somebody said, Astor. I said, yes. Okay. So Vanderbilt, yes. Morgan, J.P. Morgan, yes. If you know what they collected, you're already a player in that art market, because whatever they collected, if it ever comes back at auction, you will know how these people collect and why they collect and why that has a premium on its value. It's the same with the French couturiers, Jacques Doucet, so 1920s, late 19th century until beginning of the 20th century couturier. He was very well known for his extraordinary apartment where he collected 18th century French and continental works of art and furniture. And suddenly in 1920, he decided to get rid of all of his traditional antiques, and he went completely avant-garde. He hired Eileen Gray, Pierre Legrand, Pierre Charot, all these Art Deco designers to redo his home. And the reason why I'm mentioning him specifically and calling him an influencer is because whenever something comes up at auction that has a provenance of Jacques Doucet, it goes through the roof. Because people want that association with a forward-looking thinker. So here, that was his landing, his stair landing, and he had purchased Les Demoiselles d'Avignon as a stair landing painting, which is now in the Museum of Modern Art. Another couturier that basically studied Doucet and ended up doing very well once he passed, unfortunately, is Yves Saint Laurent. This is the apartment from the Rue Babylone, and as you can see, it's very much of a 1920s Art Deco aesthetic. So you have the little chair, the Eileen Gray chair in the foreground, and you have all these Jean Dunant, there's some Léger, Picassos, all of the same period, Art Deco period, which we often say in the trade that it's kind of recession-proof. There's kind of this timeless style. But what's interesting about the Saint Laurent sale, which happened also at Christie's in Paris, was a lot of what Saint Laurent purchased came from Jacques Doucet or had some kind of lineage to Jacques Doucet or to another couturier. This is the tiny little chair. It's actually quite small. It's very sculptural. And at the time that it came up for sale, nobody really knew how to put a value on it. it turns out it sold for 28 million. It's probably one of the most expensive chair that ever came to market. People always ask, why? Well, it's the beginning of sculptural furniture. It's extremely rare, but also it has an incredible provenance. Suzanne Talbot. Suzanne Talbot is not a real name. Her name was Mathieu Lévy, which was a Jewish name. She chose Suzanne Talbot for her business for fear of anti-Semitism. She was a hat maker. This is her salon. You can see the little chair. And this is one of her hats that's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So you see there's a lot of cross-referencing in the provenance. And it's also the interest of buying something that belonged to a woman that was very aware of what was happening socio-economically and politically in France at the time. So this little chair is often called the Mathieu Lévy chair. Provenance and connoisseurship controversy. Ruth Kligman was Jackson Pollock's lover, and she was the only survivor in the car crash that took his life in 1956. And after he died and before she died, she was going around with this tiny little painting that she said was a gift from Jackson Pollock to her. If this is true, that would be the last painting Jackson Pollock ever produced. Well, I just put the next slide here is, forget about the dimensions, it's just that it had to fit for the slide. This is a Jackson Pollock number 19, a little bigger than the one purported to be by him in the possession of Ruth Kligman. That went for $58 million. So that's why there's always people coming out of the works trying to authenticate. Now, we know all the foundations have disbanded the authentication boards because there's too many lawsuits going on. The painting was consigned to Phillips, but the painting was never sold. And the reason why it was never sold is because one of the person on the board of the Pollock Foundation was his wife, Lee Krasner, and there's no way she would have authenticated something that came from the lover that happened to be in the car in that fatal accident. So the painting has been in many, many different controversy. Now the latest is that there's been a lot of CSI testing and lab testing, and now people are saying, well, he had a polar bear rug in his studio. We found a polar bear hair in the painting, so it must be a Pollock. But that's also very controversial. And it hasn't been put at auction. Not yet, anyway. Nobody wants to touch that painting. This is an interesting case study because this is a case where the provenance was lost at one point. The history of ownership was just completely lost. And it's also an interesting case because it relates to connoisseurship and detecting what is extremely fine work and what isn't. So this is a Japanese lacquer chest from the 17th century. It's actually quite large, and it's one from a group of 12 boxes that were made for the same emperor during that period. This is two of the other boxes. So that chest was produced in Japan, eventually made its way on the Dutch East India Company and traveled to France, where it was purchased by the minister to Louis XIV, Cardinal Mazarin. This is Cardinal Mazarin, and this is a Jeff Koons rendition of a Louis XIV. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And this is a print of Cardinal Mazarin seated at a table which actually might not be a table. There's a lot of scholarship involved here. They seem to think, the scholars of this kind of material, that he is actually seated at the chest which is covered by this carpet. I think it might be a little dubious, but we'll let it go. Let's just say it's part of the story. Well, we know that the chest was in his collection. So what happens when he dies? The chest ends up going to his daughters. There's 3 daughters. What happens when the last daughter dies? It goes to William Beckford, novelist, art collector. What happens when he dies? The chest goes to Sir Clifford Corey, a coal baron. And then it disappears. It was not described properly in his estate sale. It was not called a large Japanese chest. It was called a large Chinese chest. And after that, we don't know what happened. It's the war. And then in the 70s, it ends up in a thrift shop in England. And it was acquired by a Frenchman that was looking for the Frenchman was looking for a television stand. So this magnificent 17th century chest ended up in the home of a Frenchman living in London and using it as a TV stand for many, many years. And then he decides to retire. I think it's going to come back. So he packs the chest and moves back to France. And as these things go, of course, it's not properly cataloged because he doesn't know what he has. It's basically shipped as an household item. So there's no customs, there's nothing. He just brings back his chest. There we go. Japan, ship on a Dutch East India, France, England, lost and found, thrift shop, TV stand. I made that little collage myself. 1986, he returns to France with his TV stand, as it was declared as a TV stand. Once in France, he uses it as a bar. And then the inevitable happens, he dies. Okay. So what happens? The children inherit the chest, the TV stand / bar. And nobody wants it. Because nobody recognizes that this is a magnificent work of art. So they take it to the local auctioneer, where it fetches close to $10 million. So this is a nice story that kind of melts connoisseurship and provenance. Closer to home, we have the Drake family chest, which was sold a couple of years ago through Kino Auctions. And this is an extremely rare chest from the 17th century, from the foliated vine group that stemmed out of Windsor, Connecticut in the 17th century. It is not in pristine condition. As you can see, it's missing a pull. Originally, that would have been polychrome, so it would have been red and blue and green and yellow. There's really not much to say about it. It's really an acquired taste. However, it had unbroken provenance, and it fetched close to 500,000. So unbroken provenance means that it was purchased by the family from the time that it was created, and it never left the family. And it ended up at auction because, as you know, if you cut the chest in two, give one part to your brother or your sister, you're not going to get any kind of money. So you have to put it up at auction. You can always split the cash. You can't split the canvas or the wood. Now, without provenance, a similar chest, same foliated vine group from Windsor, Connecticut, fetches about $10,000. Okay, so that's the difference with the provenance. I just wanted to talk also a little bit about connoisseurship, which involves condition. So I love this slide. I took the photograph. My photographs are not very good, but you can see that there's a terrible blemish in the center of this table. Well, it doesn't matter, because in that category of works of art, that is considered desirable. We want to see that it's been well loved. This is, so this is not a minus. This would be absolutely fine in this category of work of art. An American table, you want it to look like it's been well loved and aged. Just 15,000, that's fine. This is an interesting work. This is a carpet which had a very complex design, a vibrant history. It was extremely rare. It was published in several scholarly magazines and newsletters. It had a very impressive exhibition record, and it had an incredible provenance. It had a lot of condition problems, but because it was so rare and it had this exquisite provenance, it fetched quite a bit. So you see it says, important carpets from the William A. Clark collection, Corcoran Gallery of Art. I always tell my students, you must know who are the copper barons. So William Clark made his money in the copper mines of Montana, and he acquired the most incredible collection of works of art. Anything with a provenance of William A. Clark is of incredible value. He also purchased a lot from these antique dealers. That's another history of scholarship, knowing who are the good antique dealers, who are the ones that would actually bring more at auction than just Mr. XYZ antique dealer. Bacri Frères, anything with that kind of provenance is a plus value. And here's a little portrait of Mr. Clark where you see you could get a portrait of him for only $200. But if you bought something that he owned, you would probably have to spend $33 million. Okay. One thing I always tell my students is, know the important dogs and cats of the world. So this little dog sold for $388,000 in 2009. And when I show this to my students, they say, but why? I said, because it's a very important little dog. It's this little dog. This is one of Madame de Pompadour's favorite dog, a little spaniel called Inés. And Inés is famous in the history of Madame de Pompadour's life, and for art historian. Inés here. There's a lot of portraits of her. There's a lot of controversy. Was it Inés? Was it this other one? Because a lot of her spaniel had the same markings. But that's the difference between, what you could call, quote unquote, just a tchotchke and, a $400,000 work of art, of porcelain. This is actually quite small. So painting or photography documentation always helps when you're trying to sell something. Here's a little cat. In case there's cat people in the room, I didn't want to make anybody upset. This is a trick question. How old is this? This is actually quite old. It's a little bisque cat from Japan. It's 19th century, even though it looks very modern. And the provenance is very, very important, because as a work of porcelain, it really doesn't carry much weight. But because it belonged to this man, Claude Monet, suddenly it's not just another porcelain cat. This was Claude Monet's Japanese bisque porcelain cat. And it fetched in excess of 70,000 at auction, against a pre-sale estimate of 3,000 to 4,000, and it was purchased by a Japanese diplomat who bought it to give it back to Giverny. He said, I am giving back this cat that belonged to the studio of Claude Monet to Claude Monet. So you have to know your cats, your dogs. You should know your plants as well. So this was purchased for $20. It's a coverless teapot that sold for $800,000. And it went undetected in the market because whoever had it didn't realize what they were looking at. You're looking at a very, very rare and early manifestation of blue and white porcelain made in the United States of America. This is a South Carolina potter who started making this chinoiserie type of ware, and the birds and the tree are indigenous to South Carolina. It's an extremely rare piece of pottery. In the back of the pattern is the man on the bridge. So patterns, flowers, and birds can actually translate into a lot of money if you know when and how these plants and birds actually happen to manifest themselves in one country or the other. This could never be Chinese, this could never be British, this is indigenous to the United States. So that's the difference between $20 and $800,000. Okay, it's the earliest American teapot. It was acquired by the Met. If you go to the Metropolitan Museum, you can pass by it 20 times and not even notice it because it's so tiny. So size does not matter. The first time I saw these, I thought, oh, they're lovely. They're cabbages. It's called lettuceware, actually. And I thought, oh, maybe I should bid on that. They're wonderful. And then, well, they went for $30,000. So that was kind of way out of my budget. But the pre-sale was $1,000 to $1,500. And the reason why they went so much is because Dodie Thayer, who was an American that had a shop called Au Bon Goût in Palm Beach, Florida, has kind of a cult following. And her lettuceware has kind of a cult following. So again, it's not just, you know, the provenance, it came from the Braga collection, fine, but it's also because there's very few of these that are in good condition. And again, it's connoisseurship. These are not made in China. These are, you know, they were produced and designed by this lady in South Florida. I like to show this one because it looks like a melon. It's actually a ceramic melon. And you might see a lot of these types of wares in crafts fair for a couple of $100. This is actually $110,000. This is a Ai Weiwei ceramic melon. Okay. Again, if you don't know, you just don't know. Fabergé, I think most everyone is familiar with the jeweler. Very interesting man. That's his studio. And this is a scrapyard. And a couple of years ago, a man in the Midwest went to a scrapyard sale to buy metal. And within the pile of metal, he bought a little piece of gold for the weight, for about, I think he paid $14,000, took it home, then realized it was a watch, and he Googled the name, Boucheron, And yeah, the 14,000 turned into 33 million. Okay. It didn't look like that when he bought it. And this is the photography documentation. And again, like the big Japanese lacquer chest, this has a gap in the provenance, like it disappeared for a very long time. So, but we know in 1964 it sold for $2,400. So we think of Fabergé and the eggs. There's very few of them around. But Fabergé also produced cookware. This is a copper soup kettle with cover, brass handles from 1914, and these were made for soldiers. And they come up at auction. This one sold for $17,000, and I've seen them at the Winter Antique Show for $75,000. So again, you're not really buying necessarily the provenance. In these cases, you're buying the history. These are important because Fabergé actually made cookware for soldiers during the war. So another example of connoisseurship, this diamond ring was bought for $12 at a boot sale in the 1980s, and it sold for $840,000 in 2017. Why? Why did it go undetected? Because the cut did not translate into 20th century eyes. This is the type of cut that was made in the Victorian era, where you didn't have electricity, you looked at objects through candlelight or through very dim lights, and so you had all these very different facets on the diamond. You might have had also foil underneath, and you might not have had a mount that was necessarily platinum. It could be just some other lesser expensive material. But historically, they're extremely important. So no provenance, but it doesn't matter because in this case, if you know the story of gems and jewelry, this is a piece that is of utmost historical importance. Other items that were not meant to be necessarily on the market are institutional furnishings. This is from a film by a contemporary artist named Ami Segal. It's called Provenance. And she went to Chandigarh in India to look at the utopian city that was built by Le Corbusier and Pierre Jeanneret. And she found that all of this very desirable furniture that was designed by these architects was completely rejected by Indian society, and it's just in heaps of garbage. You can find these at flea markets in India for about $10 each. And you can buy them right Chicago for about $75,000 for a pair. So that's, the provenance is important, but the way how it got here is kind of interesting. The translation of what we value. So in the West, we value this. When it was made without any regard for how, Indian society liked to sit and how they live, It was very much of a colonialist attitude. Connoisseurship again. I remember seeing this at the Winter Show. This was sold for $375,000 to the Watford Athenaeum, and it's a completely fake piece. It was actually a piece like that was embellished, and it had fake provenance and fake everything. The Wadsworth got reimbursed, and the New York Times did a big expose on this. So connoisseurship, it's hard. Even the experts don't agree. This is in New York, not very far from here. You might not immediately recognize who did the rosette. It's this artist, it's Matisse. So there's a whole body of work of Matisse that is ecclesiastical. And you can imagine if the rose window ever came up for sale with the kind of provenance it has, a Rockefeller provenance, or if the ecclesiastical vestment came up for sale, it was acquired by Alfred Barr, the kind of money that it would, fetch. So this is also a trick question. Who did this? This is Pablo Picasso. So this is a very early Picasso from the 19th century, late 19th century, and a 1960s chair by Picasso. Again, these rarely come to market. But if you have the connoisseurship and the education and know about Picasso's completely, if you see this in a junk shop, you might do very well for yourself. The same with Victor Hugo, who is much more known as the author of Les Miserables, but he was an accomplished draftsman, and he was also the first interior decorator. He was also a very interesting man in that he upcycled. He would send his sons to buy 17th and 18th century furniture. He would reassemble it and make these incredible interiors. So again, education is very important if you're going to be in the trade of selling antiques. This is Robert Laurent, an American artist who's much more known as a sculptor, but has also a whole body of work of furniture. And just to give you an idea of value, the sculpture would not fetch much more than $15,000. The furniture has never come to market except on the retail market, where it was priced at the Fine Art ADA show at the Park Avenue Armory for $450,000. Okay. So value is all very, very relative. More on this idea of having an educated eye. These are little telephone earrings, and this is a very curious piece of ceramic. Well, the telephone earrings are by Salvador Dali, and the curious piece of ceramic is by Paul Gauguin. This is two works by Pablo Picasso. One of them is a $35 million painting from the 1930s, and the other one is a 1950s reinterpretation of the 1930s painting that was authorized by Picasso and that would not have a value that exceeds $30,000. There was a time when Picasso decided in the 50s that he was going to redo his 30s paintings in this technique called gémaille. And so he went to this little atelier and learned how to do stained glass. These are actually light boxes. There's a very large collection of them at the Corning Museum upstate, but they're not on view. So a good story. I'm going to go a little fast because we don't have so much time. The Dennis Hopper bullet hole Warhol sells for $300,000, and that was not a painting. That was actually just a print, which is very unusual. The print should not have exceeded $20,000, but because it was shot by Dennis Hopper, suddenly it had another layer of history. It was a good story, so the story matters. And so that's the difference between a $25,000 print and something that shoots up literally to $300,000. Closer in time, this was Jerry Salt's assessment of Leonardo's Salvator Mundi, who it's been said that it has 90% restoration on it, that there's very little left of the hand of the master. And yet, it went around the world with a lot of pomp and fanfare. It fetched $450 million. But there's no sign of it. Where is the painting? The painting was meant to be exhibited at the Louvre, Abu Dhabi. it's not being exhibited. There's been a lot of talk about the attribution, the connoisseurship aspect. When this painting was marketed and sold, nobody really thought of conferring with the people who owned the most Leonardo in the world, which were the French, the Louvre. Leonardo was commissioned by Francis I to paint the Mona Lisa and other paintings. But there's a little bit of snobism that happened, and they weren't confer. So they refused, the French refused to say that it's a work by Leonardo. They said, we will only hang this painting in the Louvre, Abu Dhabi, if we say it is attributed or school of Leonardo. So that's where your scholarship, connoisseurship, and idea of value absolutely explodes, because who knows, $450 million, and now you can't even put it in a museum because somebody's ego was slighted because they weren't conferred on. It's interesting. This is a different situation in terms of provenance and connoisseurship. That's at the Watford Athenaeum. And here the donor was not well researched. So for 30 years, this painting was in storage because nobody could agree whether or not it was a Van Gogh, and nobody bothered to do the proper scholarly research into the donor, who was actually a very little-known woman who had a very important collection of paintings. And once the provenance research was properly done, and once the painting was taken out of storage and sent to Amsterdam to be tested, they realized, oh dear, it is a Vincent van Gogh. And they actually found photographic documentation that was exhibited in 1913 at the New York Armory Show. I like to show this little slide because this is in New York City as well, the Museum of the City of New York. It's the famous Steinheimer sisters dollhouse. And I always wonder if this ever came to market, what would happen, because historically it's culturally extremely important for New York, because the sisters all had different roles in the fine arts or in the literary circles in New York City, and they were friends with all these incredibly significant artists, Duchamp, Margaret Zorak, Gaston Lachaise, Albert Glaise, and every work of art in the house is by one of these artists. They're a miniature version of these famous paintings. You have Nude Descending a Staircase. The large version is in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It's a priceless picture, but here you have the miniature rendering of the same painting. And the same with the Lachaise. You can actually Google it and try to find the larger versions. And I always think that's very interesting because you kind of have this colliding word of connoisseurship and provenance in this little house that a lot of people forget exists, which is on the 3rd floor of the Museum of the City of New York. I wanted to finish just showing these two slides. Here you have one of the Kennedy administration chairs that has been stripped of its upholstery. And the other slide shows a long case clock, also of the 18th century. And these are not in a context that you would think it should be. These are now no longer just a Kennedy administration frame or an 18th century clock. They've become contemporary works of art. They've been appropriated, the chair by Dan Vaux, the Danish artist, and the long case clock by Cameron Rowland, who won the MacArthur Fellowship this year. So there's a recontextualization of value here, because we know that these works are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars because they've been appropriated by the contemporary category of fine art. Whereas if you just have them in an estate sale, the Kennedy administration chair without the provenance of Jacqueline Kennedy or coming straight from the White House is not really worth that much. It's not a $100,000 chair frame. And the same with the long case clock, where you can get them for very little money now because they went out of fashion completely. So I think that's an interesting phenomenon that's going on where the value is shifted. The object stays the same, but because they're being appropriated by the contemporary art market, suddenly the value shifts. So I just wanted to end on that. And I brought a few objects to show you. I'll just take maybe a minute. Oh, thank you. In terms of connoisseurship, I thought this little painting is very interesting. So this little painting is actually quite a treasure. It's not in good condition, and to restore it would the cost of restoration would far exceed the replacement value of this painting. But it's very interesting because it's full of history. It's an Italian peasant girl, and it's unsigned, undated. But if you look at the back and you turn it around, you'll see that the linen has been stamped. And it's stamped Goupil. Goupil was a French company that had offices in Tribeca. And they moved twice. And here I have the address on Broadway. And if I do the scholarship on this, I'll find out that this painting was actually made between 1854 and 1862, when that stamp was used. Here we have a very specific gesture, and I always ask my students, can you tell me what she's doing? And there's always giggles in the room, because they're thinking in 21st century terms. But actually what she's doing is a very intimate gesture, which is she's flea picking her corsage. She's actually grooming herself, which is a typical Italian Renaissance iconography. So here you have a 19th century painting that was purchased, well, we know the material was purchased in Tribeca, Italian, French supplier, maybe a continental hand, maybe an American hand, full of mystery, but extremely interesting in terms of art history. Here, I bring this one to show my students. It's guinea hens, and they are, this little painting is signed and dated, but it's an apocryphal signature and date because, well, it's made on purpose to fool the buyer. It's very difficult to read the signature, and you can only read the first two numerals of the date, which would make it, a 19th century painting. But if I turn it around, I can see that this is definitely a 20th century backing. So this was made to fool whoever's buying it. The signature and the date was added later. So this is connoisseurship. This one is interesting because it looks like a very beautiful painting. This is actually 19th century. It's a little boy standing in the landscape, but it's actually a photograph that has been enhanced by paint because it was thought in 19th century that if you added paint to a photograph, you would make it more valuable. And this, another aspect that's interesting about that, if you look at the back, there's actually a stamp, and this was made by a woman. Which I just mentioned because there's very little scholarship on female artists. This one I brought because when I showed it to my students, they were like, oh, but it's an old master. And I said, well, if you know your colors, you'll see that these are not old master colors. These are 1950s colors. And if you look at the back, you have the label of the manufacturer of the backing, which is Fredericks, which is very well known, established since 1868. And the artist wrote her name and her address, and one student said, "Oh, but it's 17th century, it says 1648 on the back." And I said, "That's 1648 West End Avenue." So it's important to look at things front and back. And I said, you might think that this is not a very valuable painting, but actually the value in this is that this bird has a lot of personality, and that goes a long way. It doesn't always have to be something that is especially associated with artist ABC. This one I brought because it's a very curious painting. It's in terrible condition. But what I thought was very interesting was that even though it's not a pristine painting, it's got, lots of issues, at one point it was much loved. And you can see in the back that it was repaired at least 3 times before it was tossed away. And so it has value. It's a fantastic study piece. And it's also stamped by the colorist supplier and the canvas supplier. So if I do the research on this manufacturer, I'll probably know a lot more about the origins of this painting. And the other object I brought, which I thought was a lot of fun, was this little glass flower. And again, if you know your colors, you will say that this is Ohio Fenton glass. It's typical. And it's not a vase, a traditional type of vase. This was actually used in hearses. It's actually the ancestor to the air conditioner. So this would have been put in a Ford Model T. There would be 2, one next to the driver and one next to the passenger, because imagine in the heat, you're traveling with a body in the back. It probably doesn't smell very good. It's missing the little metal clamp. These were also used for centerpieces that are called épergnes, where you would have in the center of a table all kinds of sweetmeats and things like that. But I like the fact that, it has life and death all in this little turquoise flower. And that's really indigenous to the United States, to have those little flower vases. And Ford actually came up with the idea. So I'm going to leave this here, so you're all welcome to look at the back and front of these objects. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll have question and answer right now. Please wait for the microphone to be delivered to your hands so that we can record your questions for the video. And please make sure to speak directly into the microphone.
Hello. I have a question about valuation and attribution. Just hypothetically, you have an altarpiece. It's hung in a museum for 90 years as, maybe a Cimabue or something like that. It's absolutely considered his masterpiece. It's in Jansen. It's everywhere. Somebody looks at it and says, those eyes are too Cimabue. Something's wrong here. So it goes to the lab. They determine the panel is the wrong timber, and there's one mineral in the pigment that's just not only uncharacteristic but impossible. Now, it has to be reattributed, but does that make it any less of a masterpiece? Just as you'd think that someone like a forger like Van Meegeren, who is impossibly taken for Vermeer for so long, was he no less of a painter? So when you assign these multiple value, these multipliers because of who it is or to whom it belonged, if something is reattributed downward, allegedly, does it make it less of a masterpiece?
Can you hear me? Rule of thumb is it's a little bit like the Leonardo. The Leonardo was misattributed for, it was purchased in New Orleans for $10,000. And then, 80 years later, it fetches 450 million. It all depends who are the players around it, But now that value might not really stand the test of time because the picture is gone. The picture is not being acknowledged by the French authorities to be that painting. So, yeah, there could be a complete dip in the... It doesn't make it less of a masterpiece. It just depends who says it is a masterpiece and how it's marketed. There's a whole marketing machine around these things. The Leonardo was sold in a contemporary sale it was Lot 9B, Lot 9A was a Vija Selmans that went for 12 million, and the next lot after the Leonardo was a Jean-Michel Basquiat that was bought in. I mean, how curious, but it made it much more interesting, so it depends who are the players and who endorses the painting as such.
You are the head of what you've described as the umbrella of 3 institutes. Could you describe what the other 2 institutes do and how yours is different?
Yes, so there's 3 programs at the Institute. There's the Masters in Art Business, which is much more of a business program that deals with art and the law and principle of businesses as it applies to the art market. And there's a Masters in Contemporary Art, which is much more focused on the contemporary art market and curating. And my program, which is the Foundation program, which is a program that deals more with connoisseurship in the market and issues of provenance and authentication. It's 2 semesters with an optional third. Yeah.
How carefully is the legitimacy of provenance researched? It seems like it's ripe for all kinds of fraudulent stuff going on. So how do you really research the accuracy and the validity of the provenance?
With a lot of correspondence. I mean, you have to document. There's a lot of fake provenance. I mean, we saw there was some fake provenance I showed you in this. There's been lots at Christie's and Sotheby's that were proven, taken out of the sale. There's a famous Frank Lloyd Wright desk and chair that had a fake provenance. That was the cover lot a couple of years ago. That was withdrawn from the sale once Mrs. Johnson realized that no, there was no such chemist working at Johnson & Johnson these years. It's a lot of conferring with other experts. It's like checking the catalogue raisonné, getting in touch with the foundation, getting in touch with the studio or the studio manager if it's contemporary. And for older objects, it's all about going back to the archives. What are the primary sources of documentation? Just like the poppies of Van Gogh. And also forensic for the Klugman, Pollock. We don't know what's going to happen with that because it's mired in controversy, but it was sent to a lab. Yes.
Last question.
I do. I have a question sort of, sorry, question following up with similar topic. So the poppies of Van Gogh, I know that they used a lot of technology to discover it was a Van Gogh, the infrared, and so the technology very much helps authenticate old works. But what do you feel in the industry about the forgeries that are happening because of technology, with also the ability to produce works that are almost indistinguishable, particularly like with the more contemporary works, the Warhol paint colors are being able to be reproduced. And so I think that the blinds art, we're in a really tricky space between authenticating and forgery. It's tricky, and I'm just wondering what your comments and thoughts are on technology.
Well, I think that's why Sotheby's acquired Orion Analytics, Jamie Martin's lab, because there's been so many fakes, and it's just like the chest I just showed you from purportedly from the Revolutionary War, and was completely made. It's really hard to authenticate. The minute there's a market for something, there's going to be, and there's technology and development in science that's being made, there's going to be somebody that's going to take that knowledge and do something nefarious. I think there's always a risk. And there's some artists where it's more risky, like the Dali, you know, you can buy a Chagall on eBay for very little money. You know, it says Chagall, it doesn't say attributed to Chagall or anything like that. Utrillo is another example where it's been faked, like there's no tomorrow. They say Provenance. Who had it? The Knoedler case. I mean, there's a famous case of paintings that had fake provenance and people that were willing to believe in the provenance of the works. And we know they were made in a garage in Queens. And tens of millions of dollars were exchanged for these paintings. It's, yeah. Yes.
Yes. With your students, do you get any of the "Hey Boomer"? This seems so esoteric or pretentious. These prices and all that. I mean, it seems like a arts gratia artis type thing, maybe.
No, I think maybe I'm very lucky. My students, I've never had that "Hey Boomer" appellation. I think they're interested in the history of pricing and how you value things, because eventually they're going to be confronted with that if they're you know, have an estate to deal with, whether it's their own estate or the estate of somebody else. So they're very curious on how to manage that aspect of, you know, life. You know, we live in all of this as some kind of intrinsic value, but you know, how far does it go, and how much time should you spend researching it? Is it worth it to spend 20 hours researching this desk, you know? Thank you. Thank you. I encourage you to have a look at what I brought.
But before you do, Anne-Marie, we would like to express our huge appreciation for your illuminating talk, your vast knowledge. And I think we all, well, I think many of us know so much more about provenance and connoisseurship, and you explained it so elegantly, and it is fascinating. And of course, we all have a fantasy of walking to that antique store and finding that Japanese cabinet, don't we? And then becoming millionaires. So I think it appeals strongly. And you also made it so clear, it's all about stories. You so eloquently conveyed that. So thank you so much. We're really delighted that you could share your expertise. Thank you very much. And we would like to make a presentation to you, and to do so is our Executive Director, Victoria Dangle.
Thank you, Karen. And thank you, Anne-Marie. And I would love to be one of your students. Didn't everyone just so enjoy? You're so captivating. Thank you so much. Thank you. And so, Anne-Marie, on behalf of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen, founded 1785, we express our gratitude to Anne-Marie Richard, Sotheby's Institute of Art, Director, MA Fine and Decorative Art and Designs Program, for Hammer and Homework, Auction and Education, the impact of connoisseurship and provenance on the valuation of works of art, for her participation in the General Society Artists and Lecture Series. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm very appreciative you came. Thank you.
Okay. Well,
oh my God.
It's not over just yet, Anne-Marie. Because as many of our lecture goers know, we never let anyone go, so we've made you a lifetime member of the library because we really wanted to come back. Thank you.